Okay, this video is on properties of equality, and these properties of equality are properties that you have already been using when you solve equations, although you may not have realized that you were using them or known what the names were. So we're going to talk about those in terms of these examples. So if you take a look at example number 1, here's this equation that we have to solve, and it's a fairly simple equation, but we're going to solve it, and we're going to write down very clearly what our steps are, and then we're going to explain each step and the property behind each step. So step number 1, solving this equation, I can see x minus 12 equals 7. I need to add 12 to both sides so that I can get x by itself. Well, adding 12 to both sides, that's step 1. That's my first step in solving this equation. Adding 12 to both sides, that's what I'm doing here. So I'm just going to write that here under the explain column. Add 12 to both sides of the equation. Now this property, the property that allows me to add 12 to both sides, that's just called, let's call this number 1 here, That's just called the addition property of equality. So that's the name of the property that tells me that I can add 12 to both sides as the first step in solving this equation. So when I add 12 to both sides, the next thing that I do is I essentially combine my like terms. And I'm not necessarily, every time I solve an equation, I don't necessarily do this exactly the same way, but here I'm going to call this an actual separate step. I'm going to call this step 2. I'm going to combine all the like terms that I have now. So if I combine my negative 12 and positive 12 here, then I have x left over. And if I combine 7 and 12 here, then I have 19. And that's the second step in solving this equation. So explaining this step, I would say I'm just combined like terms. And that property, the combining like terms, that's just a property called the substitution property of equality. It's called the substitution property of equality because all I'm doing when I use this property is I'm just substituting, in this case, I'm substituting the number 19 for 7 plus 12. And I'm substituting 0 or nothing for negative 12 added to positive 12. All right, let's take a look at example number 2. Again, I'm going to start by calling this step 1. And again, this is a simple equation, and I can see what I need to do in order to solve this equation is subtract 12 from both sides. So let me explain what I'm doing here. I'm subtracting 12 from both sides. Subtract 12 from both sides of the equation. And the name of the property that tells me that I can subtract 12 from both sides of the equation, that's called the subtraction property of equality. My step number 2 in solving this equation is again to collect my like terms, that is my positive 12 and negative 12. I'm going to combine those terms, and they essentially combine to 0. So my positive 12 and negative 12 go away. I'm going to combine 7 and negative 12, which gives me a negative 5. And so my step number 2, explaining that step, I'm going to say I'm combining like terms. And again, just like before, the property that allows me to do that is called the substitution property. I'm just going to abbreviate it. Substitution property of equality. Example number 3. Here's another fairly simple equation. And I can see the first thing I need to do to solve this equation to get x by itself, since I've got x multiplied by 3, I'm going to undo that by dividing both sides by 3. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and write down 3x divided by 3 equals 18 divided by 3. That's my step number 1. And what I'm doing in this step is dividing both sides by both sides of the equation by 3. And you may have already guessed that the name of this property that allows me to divide both sides by 3 is called the division property of equality. Step number 2. Once again, I'm essentially going to, in this case I'm not really combining like terms, but I'm doing something very similar to what I did before. I'm going to replace 3x divided by 3 with x, and I'm going to replace 18 divided by 3 with 6. And I'm going to call that simplifying. But what I'm calling simplifying, I'm actually doing essentially the same thing that I did in examples 1 and 2. I'm using the substitution property of equality again. In this case, what I'm substituting, instead of 3 divided by 3 on this side, 3 divided by 3 is the same as 1. So I'm basically substituting 3 divided by 3 for 1 times x. And I'm substituting the number 6 for 18 divided by 3. So that's the substitution property again. Example number 4. Step number 1. Now, since I've got a division on this side, x divided by 3, my first step is going to be to multiply to undo this division. So I'm going to multiply both sides of my equation by 3. So I'm going to have 3 times x over 3 equals 5 times 3. And to explain what I'm doing, I am multiplying both sides of the equation by 3. And again, you may have already guessed that the name of this property is the multiplication property of equality. Step number 2, again, I'm going to do essentially what I did in the other problems. I'm going to simplify in this case, I'm going to simplify by canceling out my 3's here, so I'm left with x on this side. 5 times 3 is 15. So I've solved this equation. Step 2 is simplifying from step 1. And once again, this simplifying is really just substituting. I'm substituting the number 1 for 3 divided by 3, and I'm substituting the number 15 for 5 times 3. So this again is just the substitution property of equality.